get me in front of a big, giant grizzly bear, alligator, or shark, and you tell me, oh, that's just excitement, then you are full of garbage. We need a signal that we need to get away, that we need to fight or flee or freeze. And so we have that fear response. Hey everyone, welcome to Flow Over Fear. And I wanted to get into an episode where I talk about our relationship with fear and how we can change it into something more empowering for ourselves. And I do this as I'm putting a lot of thought into how my relationship with fear has evolved over my own life. I've been giving quite a few keynotes and talks lately on this subject and refining my message. And in that, I talk a lot about my experience with fear and how it changed from somebody who was fighting fear, who was constantly making most of my decisions in my life out of a desire to avoid or fight against or run from that fear or anxiety. And it led to a lot of anxiety and a lot of panic in my life, which of course sent me down a path of addiction and alcoholism. But eventually that relationship with fear evolved into something a little more powerful, where I'm able to look at that fear, still experience it, but also be able to see the signals in it and see what it's telling me and see what it's trying to convey to me about where I am in my life and what might need to change or transform or what I need to lean into or what opportunities I might have. And when we can change our relationship in that way, I realize that, the anxiety and the fear and everything that we experience is really just this broad spectrum that ranges from fear being this debilitating panic and shameful and horrible thing that dominates our lives in such a negative way, to the extent of trauma and addiction and all sorts of negative things, to being something that can be empowering. I mean, we see people's responses to fear in a lot of different ways. We see the fear that really debilitates and takes people out, right? That really just, that causes really tremendous mental health issues and panic and all of that destructive behavior. But then we see it on the other side where it actually fuels passion, where we see people see that fear as almost an excitement thing. And they're able to lean into that and produce more and make more and be more, bring more value to the world and lean into bigger things. How can we get more onto that side? And I think one of the first steps that's important to acknowledge there is that there are two levels, or there are two essentially sides of that spectrum. And on the side where there is trauma, where there is, severe mental health problems or things that need to be healed, that's where healing is required. We cannot grow our way out of things that we need to heal from. It's kind of like if you break your leg and you want to go, if you're a marathon runner and you have a compound fracture in your leg, you can't just start running on it and expect it to get better and get stronger. You have to heal first. So one of the first messages I think I want to share here is that you have to know where you're at on that spectrum in a variety of areas. Is, do you need to heal, or are you in a position to grow? And for that healing side, that requires obviously somebody who has a lot more letters after their name than I do. It requires community. It takes a lot of intensive therapy, and I'd encourage you to find that help if that's where you're sitting. But on the growth side of it, I think that there's a way that we can reframe that and start to build on the growth more toward that fear and excitement being on the same spectrum level. We hear that a lot, by the way. You hear the people that say that, oh, excitement and fear, those, are excitement and anxiety, those are on the same wavelength. So you're basically just feeling the same thing. Okay, I agree with that in concept. Maybe you're right. Maybe the same chemicals are firing, but also there's a lot more nuance to that. I think that we need to acknowledge that when somebody is going through serious trauma or serious fear or whatever that may be, we cannot expect, hey, you need to just reframe that into excitement, because it's all the same chemicals firing. It's a lot deeper than that. And I'm not going to minimize the experience of somebody who has that severe trauma or that fear that they're experiencing. And also, if you get me in front of a big, giant grizzly bear, alligator, or shark, and you tell me, no, that fear that you're feeling, that's just excitement, then you are full of garbage. Let me tell you that much. So conceptually maybe correct, from a chemical level, we may be seeing the same chemicals firing, but definitely not the same experience. And we have to approach them differently. And there's a lot of steps that we have to take between that fear feeling negative and like an obstacle and like a barrier in our way, to feeling that excitement and joy and enthusiasm and going. So let's talk a little bit about how we can reframe that, because the way we change it from that terrible, debilitating feeling to something more of excitement is not in getting rid of it. And that's why I want to kind of go over what it's not first. We cannot get rid of the fear, because the fear is something that we feel. Anxiety exists for a reason, and it's existed throughout the course of human history. Hundreds of thousands of years, human beings have felt fear and anxiety for a reason. It has told us to avoid the things that might kill us, because the things that might kill us, we need to know. We need a signal that we need to get away, that we need to fight or flee or freeze. And so we have that fear response. Now, the problem is that more recently, we don't run into a lot of situations that are genuinely life-threatening to us in the first world. Now, that may be true of some people, but in most cases, the vast majority of cases where we feel that anxiety in our lives, it's not because we're in immediate danger. So what is it? We still feel like we're running from it, or we still feel like we're ruminating it. It's still in our minds, right? So what is it? So that feeling of fear that we're feeling, though, it's tied to this idea of anxiety. And I think that it's really rooted in these ideas that fear and anxiety and limiting beliefs are kind of like this Venn diagram, that we have limiting beliefs on one side that are reinforced by our fears. Those limiting beliefs are those beliefs that we have about the future, or beliefs about the world or ourselves that feel like obstacles, that were formed out of our experiences or our behaviors or our interpretations of those experiences that form these beliefs. And then our fears, those specific anchors to things that we're afraid of, like fear of confrontation or fear of rejection or fear of, whatever that specific fear might be. And when we feel those limiting beliefs can fuel the fear, and the fear can fuel the limiting beliefs, and the limiting beliefs can fuel the fear, and so on and so forth. And it creates this cycle of fear that we get trapped in that just makes that anxiety expand. And so what we have to do is we have to break that pattern. We have to break that pattern and break that cycle. And it comes to first really understanding it and learning really what it takes to get beyond that. And I think that what it takes is we have to first accept the dance with fear and really understand what that fear is trying to tell us. Then we dance with it. And I believe that dance is really a waltz. It's a waltz. And the first step in that waltz. So a waltz has 3 steps, right? 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. That's the waltz. And the 3 steps that I'm talking about here is, first you want to name it. The second step is you want to reframe it. And the third step is you want to expose it. And so talking about the name it step, naming it is really just doing that. When we're running or when we're fighting against fear, we're trying to suppress it down. We're trying to convince ourselves that it doesn't exist. And so we're trying to get over it just by sheer force. But what we have to do instead, in order to overcome it, we have to get it out of our head and we have to name it. And the naming process really requires us to write it down on a piece of paper or wherever it may be, and then share it with someone we trust. We have to have a community of trust that we can share it with. This may be a trusted therapist, or it may be a trusted community, but make sure that community is full of trust. We have to be willing to be vulnerable in that community. And this was a very important and powerful first exercise for me when I got sober. My sponsor literally gave me a piece of paper that said, that had the word fears written over the top of it. And it was part of a 4-step inventory. That 4-step inventory is part of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And part of that inventory was to really acknowledge and name all of the fears that I had in my life, to put them out on paper. And this was a powerful, powerful exercise that is profoundly important in the world of the 12-step program, is making an inventory of something. And when you talk about making an inventory of something, it's really quantifying it on, in your mind or on a piece of paper. It was making an inventory of those fears. So that was one of the primary steps of that 4-step inventory process, was making a list of the fears that I had in my life. Hey, everyone, I interrupt this program to introduce you to a powerful tool that will help you gain clarity on your vision and accelerate your growth and achievement. If you're listening to this show, it is likely that you have an exciting vision for your life. But the problem is that we often get caught up in the day-to-day. We get distracted. We face uncertainty, overwhelm, and self-doubt. And as a result, the gap between where you are and where you want to be seems insurmountable. And that's why I created a framework for how you can turn your vision into strategic, disciplined action that will accelerate your results in the next 90 days. I call it the Vision Reflection Retreat. It is a 2-day solo excursion designed to reignite passion and adventure into your busy life and realign your focus toward your why. This is the very same framework that I use every 90 days to reflect on my own life and my vision and set my goals for the next quarter. And it has been a game changer. And the good news is that I'm giving away this Vision Reflection Retreat guidebook for free when you sign up for my newsletter. Simply go to flowoverfear.com/retreat and download your free guide and enjoy the journey. And I thought that this was a ridiculous exercise because I didn't know how the idea of just writing fears down was going to take power away from them or anything like that. I thought that writing fears down was going to make me more afraid because I was going to be putting them on paper, writing them there. I would have to look at them. I would have to share them, and that would make me more afraid. But the exact opposite happened, because when I wrote them down, and when we write down our fears, it gets them out of our head, and it acknowledges them as real. First of all, it validates them in our minds as something that we are feeling. And when we validate ourselves, we give ourselves the authority to actually feel the feelings that we're feeling. And that's an important thing to do. We're entitled to our feelings. Now, that doesn't mean that we should stay there, but we're entitled to knowing what our feelings are. And if we can, and that is really the first step to moving beyond them or moving through them and working through them. And so when I named them and then I shared them with my sponsor, it took some of that power away from it. Just as when you're fighting against it or suppressing it or pushing it down, gives that fear more power, writing it down and sharing it with someone you trust takes the power away from it. That's exactly what I did. And that's really the first step of the dance, is writing it down. So I would encourage you I would encourage you to make a list, make an inventory of your fears, write them down. And maybe even if it's just more targeted right now, something that's causing you anxiety or right now, get to the root cause of it. Understand that anxiety might be fueled by uncertainty, overwhelm, or self-doubt. And then name that specific fear. What is that fear that you're afraid of? I'm afraid of the confrontational conversation I'm going to have with this colleague, or I'm afraid of picking up the phone on a daily basis because every time I've picked up the phone in the past, it's been somebody that's told me something that's wrong, and so it's developed this anxiety. You get more information, you get more data collection that way, and so that's a powerful way to do it. And then the second step in the dance, after you've done that first step of the waltz, the second step in the waltz is the reframe step. This is where you can actually turn that fear, and you could try to find the opportunity in it. And that's not always an easy step. And you may be asking yourself, how am I supposed to take this thing that is feeling like such a burden, and it's wearing me out, and I'm so exhausted by this anxiety that I'm feeling and this fear? How am I supposed to reframe it into something more positive or into an opportunity? Well, it's not always easy, but that's why it's an important second step, because really your choices are, you could sit there with it and ruminate with it or fight against it and not change it and let that and continue to be a victim to your circumstances. Or you can try to reframe it into something of an opportunity. If you've listened to the guests on this show that I've had, you have consistently heard guests like Ike Chan, or who's a guest that's coming up, or Casey Campbell, who was fighting in Iraq, or any number of the guests that I've had on this show who have experienced times of fear and become more focused, or turned it into an opportunity, or have experienced challenging circumstances and have been able to shape that into to their benefit and turn it into an advantage. How can you turn that anxiety or fear that you have, after you've named it, after you've acknowledged where it's coming from? What does it look like to turn that into something more positive or into an opportunity? And one of the ways in which you can start to do that and start to come out of that victim mentality that you may be thinking about, that you may be staying in or circling around in, that's not feeling good, is to look at the points of reference that you have in your own life. The experiences that you've had, or the times when you've persevered through specific challenges. Think about those times, name those times, write those times down. And those can serve as the foundation to demonstrate to you that you're imminently capable of working through whatever this fear or challenge is that is causing you anxiety. Maybe it's the fact that you worked through a big challenge in your past life with regard to difficult conversations that you've had, and it's led to something more beneficial. Maybe you had a difficult conversation with someone you love that you didn't want to have in the first place, that was causing you tremendous anxiety. But once you got that off your chest and once you worked through that conversation, your relationship was never better. What are those points of reference, and what do they look like to you? When you could turn those into opportunity, those can be the things that really reshape your life. It's almost like this is like if you think of yourself maybe 10 years ago going through a challenge, of a challenge that you didn't know how you could make it through a decade ago. And if you yourself could go back in time and tell yourself what it's going to take to get through that, this is your opportunity to do just that. Is you're looking back at that and you're setting those points of reference. And now you can look forward as your future self and meet yourself where you're at today. What would your future self 10 years from now tell you in this moment about the thing that's causing you anxiety or fear? That person's been wildly successful or changed their life or gotten through this specific scenario. What are they going to tell you about it that you need to know? And set that as a point of reference. And then that can be your opportunity to turn this fear or this anxiety into an opportunity, right? And then the final step of the dance is exposing it. And this is where the action steps take place. Because if you're feeling that chronic anxiety over something, like this anxiety of moving forward, maybe it's the anxiety of picking up a phone. I had that one time within the last few years where I just kept getting phone calls within my work. It was early on when I took on the role of CEO of the company that I'm in. And I kept getting calls of things that were just going wrong and problems that I would have to solve. And it was causing me so much stress. Every time I'd get a phone call, I'd have to manage these things. And it got to the point where I dreaded picking up the phone anytime it rang. It didn't matter who rang. It could be my wife, and I dreaded picking up the phone because I just didn't want to pick up the phone. And that became a debilitating fear and anxiety of mine. It was the phone ringing, picking it up. And so the idea of exposure, of little exposures and incremental exposures to help overcome that anxiety, this is where that fits in. Because instead of like taking a giant step or giant leap forward to try and just overcome that fear by sheer force of will and just answer every call and probably produce more of a trauma than it actually is, instead, this kind of gradually and incrementally exposes you to specific discomforts that expand your comfort zone. It's like lifting weights. You want to lift a few pounds at a time so you can grow the muscle, and then you increase the weight over time until you're actually this super buff Arnold Schwarzenegger type of dude who's going to dominate the Mr. Universe competitions and all that kind of things. So that's what you want to build with regard to your mindset. Start with the 5 pounds and then build to Arnold Schwarzenegger strength. That's how you do it. And with regard to this, so you start with those little exposures. If it's, say, it's using that phone call as an example, in that instance, what I did was I just started by making a simple phone call every day, by picking up the phone and calling somebody that I knew every day to desensitize myself to the idea of getting on the phone and talking. And this time I was instigating it. So I wasn't receiving the random phone calls like that. That gave me the sensation is, okay, I can handle the phone calls. What's the next step? All right, now I'm going to pick up the phone call on the first ring of the people that I know. And I picked that up, and that's how I answered it. I answered those calls. And I started to sensitize myself to that. And then I moved on to the next step, which was answering the phones of the more challenging calls that I might not wanted to have, and realizing I could handle that, and then desensitizing myself, so on and so forth, so that I was answering the calls of telemarketers and telling them to stop calling me and take me off their lists. I was becoming the Arnold Schwarzenegger of phone calls. Is what I was becoming. Is what I'm trying to say. No, but those are really the steps in the dance. Is exposing yourself. And what I would call that is, that's where only the 5% rule that I talk about with frequency comes in, is just take those small 5% steps beyond your comfort zone to gradually increase your comfort zone. And that's really the dance you want to do with fear, to reframe your relationship with it over time. And it doesn't happen instantly, and it's not remotely comfortable. But the truth of the matter is that if you learn to dance with fear in this way, as my coach, Kirk Wayman, who was on this show about a year ago, has said, and he's really responsible for introducing me to this concept of dancing with fear, though the 3 steps has kind of been my little addition to it. The idea of dancing with fear, while it's not wildly comfortable, helps us to expand our comfort zone and grow into a more abundant freedom beyond our fear. It takes us out of that victim mentality where we're constantly circling the drain of fear, and we're fighting it and we're suppressing it. Because when we're fighting it, I don't know if this is the way you felt about, your experience with fear. This is how I experienced it. But in the instant where I ran from fear or ran from things that were scary in my life, I got this instant dopamine hit where it was like, oh, comfort zone. I avoided that thing and it feels so good in that instant. But the long-term effects of that were that the fears just started compounding on top of each other and kept getting worse over time, until it was something that I could no longer run from. It was something that was just part of me all the time. And that's where I became truly a victim to it, and I just couldn't get away from it. And it took a lot of work and a lot of healing to work through that. But if we can change that relationship to leaning into a little bit of discomfort in the moment to make the long term more courageous, that's where we begin to grow and find that excitement that exists in the fear and the joy that exists in that fear. So I want to challenge you to do that today. Learn to dance with fear. Find that 3-step, name it, reframe it, and then you expose it. And I hope that takes you out of feeling like a victim to it and starts giving you a little bit more empowerment. Thanks for joining me today. I'll see you next time. Thank you so much for joining me today on Flow Over Fear. If you are liking this show, please do me a favor and hit the subscribe button. That way you'll be first to know when I drop a new episode, including interviews or trainings or dad jokes. That's right, dad jokes. Add a little levity to your life. And if you liked this episode in particular and you think somebody can get something from it, please share it with a friend. And that way we'll spread the message together. Thanks again for joining me today. We'll see you next time.